Today's video is going to be a big double-length tribute to the 25th anniversary of the Superman the Animated Series finale episode, Legacy. This will be a rare dual look at my two newest figures with full making-of footage for each. So strap in and let's watch Superman go from brainwashed to battle-damaged. My recipe for the Brainwashed Superman is a fairly simple one. Let's call him Lord Kal-El. Shout out to Fernando2912 for the name. You could certainly just use a full Superman body if you can get your hands on one for a good price. Until McFarlane re-releases this guy, he's kind of tough to get a hold of. With that in mind, I thought I could use an anti-fire suit Batman for a few reasons. 1, his helmet would be a great base for Kal-El's. 2, he has the pointed shoulders I was looking for to match the character model. And 3, he's a similar size to Superman. The biggest difference is the length of his legs. I had some TNBA Bane legs left from our previous custom and figured those would do well to make up that height difference. Full disclosure, he's a touch tall compared to the STAS figure, but I thought it would be okay since he'll only be up on a flight stand with his standard of war in hand. The pointed shoulders ended up not needing to be entirely necessary once I realized I'd need to make full shoulder pieces attached to him, but we'll get to those later. For now, we're ready to begin demolition. There actually won't be a whole lot of dremeling for Kal. You'll want to cut the bat ears off, dremel the symbol off, dremel down the forearm cuffs, and then make the hips work. To do that, dremel the hip holes bigger and then take the height of the hips down so they'll fit into the spaces of his waist. I took his belt off too because it was just a little too deformed for my liking. Instead, I'm thinking I could still cut the main parts of the belt off and put it back around his waist so I can fill the gap and retain articulation there. Sand all of your dremeled areas and we can start sculpting. The first thing I'll sculpt is to add some epoxy on Bane's shins to cover up the lines they had sculpted in. While those are curing, let's round off Kal-El's head, on the top and in the back. Once those cure, sand them down and start sculpting the symbol thing on his chest. Lay some epoxy down in the general area and then begin to cut away to find the shape you want. It may take a few passes and multiple slivers off, but careful precision is always best. Next I'll move down to his thigh shapes, those famous Kryptonian rectangles that have been present since the pilot on Jor-El's outfit. Same idea here as with the chest. Push a small glob of epoxy on and around and then cut away the excess to form your shapes. Back up to the head, we can form and cut the red Mandalorian frame shapes to his helmet. I'll come back down to the torso and shape the back part of his red emblem thing. Leave a comment below if you know or have an idea what this shape is supposed to emulate, because I've always kind of wondered that. Once the torso is cured, we can come back up to the helmet and place the top piece of the red frame to complete the look. Dremel all of these latest additions if you made any of them too thick, and then sand them all down smooth. Next, we can layer on the gray neck area armor piece on the front and back. Push the epoxy down, cut the curved shape on the bottom of it, and then smear it towards the collar with some water to make it disappear and fade in naturally. Now we can add the first lower red rings on his shins using some rolled and pressed epoxy. Moving up to the forearms, we'll do the same type of thing here and then cut them off at half circles. I have a little excess epoxy left and I never want to throw any of it out. It's always best to have a kind of garbage piece that you can go to and throw it on instead of getting rid of it. For example, I have a Hulk that has slowly been building up over the last few years to turn into a Doomsday, and I'll add my excess to him. Lord Kal-El's forearms have cured now, so I can add the secondary and larger piece on his wrist area. Push it down, cut out your shape, and repeat it on the other side. His shins have that same motif, but then they added a circle to echo his belt and backs of his hands. For that circle, I looked around for something I could use to push that shape in, and the DCC stand pole worked perfectly. I mentioned his handguard dots and belt, and we can add those on real quick now too. As we've been doing, let all of that cure and then lightly dremel and sand smooth. Now for his shoulder plate pieces. I wondered if I had anything I could use to make them look natural and be an easy addition. I looked around me at the figures on display and then it hit me when I saw TNBA Batman. His closed cape piece had the perfect shoulder coverings I would need. So I went to my cape bin and pulled out that cape to test fit it onto the Firebat shoulders. Sure enough, perfect fit. I drew out the shapes I'd need with a marker and then used an X-Acto knife to cut them out of the cape. The next borrowed pieces I used were the ones I've had in mind for a couple years now. The Gods and Monsters Wonder Woman hails from Apokolips, and I believe they may have echoed some design ideas from Lord Kal-El with her as a result. As such, I naturally used her face guard shapes to form the base of Kal-El's helmet protrusions too. Cut the bottom portion off, turn it around, and it'll work perfectly with the angled cut facing in on his helmet. Stick them on with some epoxy and blend it in. Once they're dry, carefully refine the shapes with your disc Dremel on low to make them flat. I talked about displaying him with his standard flag. For the pole, I can't remember where I got these, but I have some white metal poles that will fit perfectly in his hand. Bonus with them already being white is that they won't chip away from the grip of his hand or sliding the pole in. The last thing to add is his belt. With any rubber additions I make, I like to start with a paper prototype and get everything just right to save on experimenting with the much costlier rubber. Measure things out, cut it, wrap it around, and then mark out where the segments are to cut those out. Transfer your paper shapes to rubber and glue those onto his existing belt. All of his additions are in place, so now we can start adding some color. I'll start out using Americana Slate Gray to pick out the accents of his shoulder armor pieces, gloves, boots, belt, and thigh shapes. Next, I'll use some Vallejo Flat Red on his torso symbols, forearm guards, boots, and belt buckle dot. Then his main black bodysuit with Vallejo Black. Another bonus with using the Firebat body as a base is that you won't have to paint his joints and will be able to retain some articulation that way. Up to the helmet, start with the same gray for the base and then add on the same red for the frame around the eyes, the face guard pieces, and then the eyes themselves. All of these will need additional coats and any cleanup applied. Now if you know this design, you may be wondering, what about those shoulder pads? Aren't they missing some red trim? I was going back and forth on their shape quite a bit because the way they were drawn, the red sticks up and the pad itself is fairly flat to his shoulders. Since I was already using separate pieces for the armor, I thought it might be too thick to sculpt the red on top of that. Ultimately, I thought it needed the thickness, so I turned to green stuff to get the job done. I'm using it because it remains a little flexible and it would allow the pad to move up and bend a bit when raising his arm to hold his flag. Cut some off, mix it, roll it very thinly, and place it onto the pad all the way around its perimeter. Dremel it down, as well as some thickness off of the inside, and then repeat the process on the other one. Now they're ready for the same Vallejo red to match and then glue them onto his shoulders. I've mentioned his flag a few times now, so let's finish that up. I found a wonderful image online of Superman's shield from the show. Huge thank you to World's Finest Online for their database of images. I go there so often, it might as well be my homepage. I can't believe I've made this many videos without mentioning them yet. Anyway, I edited the image to work and then printed essentially a 2.5 by 4 inch rectangle. Cut the bottom triangle out, and then curled the ends to get a bit of a wind-blown effect going. Next, get some black styrene and draw and cut the shape for the piece that holds the flag. Paint that up with some folk art cottage white, and then tape it all together and to the pole. The final piece that will really make this warlord shine is this glow-in-the-dark, slightly transparent orange paint. Add a couple coats to his eyes and look how truly imposing he can look. Oh man, do I love the way he came out, straight out of the show. That covers part 1 of Legacy, and now we can look at its epic conclusion. The ripped up look that Superman gets at the very end of his battle with Darkseid has always stuck with me since I first saw it 25 years ago. When making my large customs list, this look was one I knew I would have to have on my shelf. The recipe is super obvious here, so we'll just jump straight to the damage. Given how messed up he gets, there isn't a whole lot of dremeling needed here on his body. We only need to remove small parts of his S on either side. The real visual trick will all be in the sculpting. I say it's a trick because all you're really doing is adding some epoxy on top and then smoothing it in to look like it's the costume with a hole ripped into it. Roll some epoxy out and place it in the general shape around his thigh. Push it down really thin all around the outside and then smooth it even more with some water. Next, you can take your X-Acto knife on the inside of the area and cut some fine little details for the shredded cloth. Scrape and sand the area you dremeled from the S-shield and do the same epoxy addition technique up there, matching to the source material for the shape of his tatters. Speaking of tatters, his cape. That thing takes a beating in this episode. Take your disc Dremel and just cut into that thing and really have some fun with it. Switch to the cone Dremel tip and add in some of those holes you see when he drops down. Continue placing thin rolls of epoxy around his left shoulder and right forearm. The nice thing with those is that they don't have to be blended in, since the fold of the clothing is on the top and the shreds hang down over it. His left forearm needs a similar thing done to it as we did to his left thigh. And then the right side of his torso is almost all laid bare with a large ripped piece hanging down past his belt. In order to retain waist articulation, I've decided to use green stuff for the part that hangs down. To save on the more expensive green stuff, I used epoxy all the way down to the belt and then added just a sliver of green stuff and pulled it down and cut it into shape. Oh, and his hair gets a little messed up too, so add some epoxy on the top and then give him a secondary curl. Dremel and sand all of your sculpted additions down if needed, and then we're ready to paint. I started out with a different color scheme than I ended up with, but I think both could work. Originally I went with this Craftsmark brick red for all of his now brown red parts. Then my standard Delta Ceramcoat tawny medium for his skin. The Apple Barrel Vanilla Ice Cream for his yellows never changed, but the Apple Barrel Pewter Gray did. Again, this is a decent representation from the scene, but it wasn't quite giving the sunburnt toasted vibe I was going for. To darken things up, I needed to mix colors for the red, peach, and gray. His skin tones needed to be much more orange and saturated, so I mixed the tawny medium with Craftsmart Orange Spice and then a dash of that brick red. That was a bit too saturated, so I pulled it back slightly with some pewter gray. That's a helpful tip. Anytime you need to reduce saturation, just add a few drops of light gray to your color. Oh yeah, that's so much better. Now he's looking like some Omega beams just cooked him. For the gray, I noticed that it's actually more of a darker purpley gray. That would make sense too, as it used to be blue and is now being washed in red light from Apocalypse. I chose to mix Apple Barrel Concord Grape with the Americana Gray Storm for that. Lastly, the red uses Folk Art Dark Brown mixed into that Craftsmart Brick Red, and then desaturated with some Apple Barrel Pewter Gray and Americana Gray Storm. Using the same colors in some of these mixes will really help to have an underlying uniformity to the final look too. Let's see how these colors look now. Again, much better. The gray may look a little purple to start, but you have to trust that the final result will make sense when it's all pulled together. Painting colors with an effective lighting on them will do that, but it's all worth it in the end. The inside of his cape is darker to look like shadow, so I wanted to represent that with some Americana Dark Umber. Grab some Vallejo black for his hair, belt loops, and the majority of his underwear. Just leave that little sliver of cell shading on his side. Now for the detailed scratches and his face work. I turn to these handy fine point pigment liners. Point 1 for all the thin lines and eyes, and then point 3 for his eyebrows. These things are such a lifesaver, and I wish I knew about them for faces years ago. The last touch is some Apple Barrel Flamenco Red for the blood trickling down his chin. I say that's last, but in preparing for my shoot, I really wanted to recreate that famous confrontation shot of Darkseid coming up to Superman. To do that, I'd need a battle-damaged Darkseid to match him. So, super special bonus here, let's make his damaged head too. Luckily I've already made a Darkseid head from an Etrigan and we'll cover him in a separate video, but I needed to make a cast of that head for this. I tried my amazing mold putty first, but that didn't seem to work. I think it may have expired? So that's a warning to you that you can't let that stuff sit for too long. Use it up while you can. Next, I failed with my trusty Oyumaru. Not sure why, but that didn't work very well this time. Then I remembered that I still hadn't tested the new Silonaut stuff. I gave that a try and threw it in the microwave. It says to only do it in 30-second increments, and it only took a total of maybe 3 minutes to heat the entire bottle up. I hot glued my Darkseid head into a small Dixie cup, shout out to Rocco the Great for his casting process videos, and then poured the liquid Silanot over the head. Let it cure for quite a few hours, and then peeled it apart, and then popped the original head out. I first tested some epoxy in the mold, but this stuff is extremely flexible, and the epoxy stretched out, and I ended up with a Stonehenge-looking Darkseid. I figured that meant I could only use a pourable resin in this mold, so I turned to my smooth-on, smooth-cast, bright white liquid plastic. Mix it up, but be careful how much you mix. It's easy to make too much, so have additional molds on hand so you don't waste anything. I still ended up wasting a huge chunk of it, but I'm wondering if I can repurpose it for a clay face or something later. There we go, that did the trick. Dremel off excess and then start cutting off his helmet. Since my mold making process went so poorly, I had very little time until I needed to shoot and post for the 25th anniversary date. That meant I'd only be painting what the camera would see, so you'll only see me painting about half of his head. Start with a base gray with the Americana Gray Storm again. Then Vallejo Black for his helmet base. Vallejo Red for the eyes. Anita's Royal Blue for the cel-shaded coloring of the helmet. Delta Ceramcoat Dark Goldenrod for his orange cracks on his head. More Vallejo Black for the blood all over his face, nose, and mouth. Craft Smart Navy for a darker cel-shaded blue, and he's all done. Time to take some pictures. Oh my goodness, look at this. I love it. I shaped some steam from the Oyumaru earlier and placed it behind Darkseid for a little added effect. This ripped up Superman instantly brings me back to watching this moment on TV, and I couldn't be happier with him. Super nice bonus to have Darkseid's battle damage head on a stand next to him now too. Phew, we made it. Thanks for watching this fun tribute to the Man of Steel. Drop a like if you enjoyed it and subscribe for more monthly content like this and occasional shorts featuring tips or additional customs. Go ahead and leave any questions or requests for future characters in the comments below. Follow me on Instagram if you want to see more customs like these and all of my latest work. Join me next time for a double dose of the Martian Manhunter. We'll tackle another Justice Lord and look at making his true Martian form. Check out the rest of my catalog of videos while you wait for that next one. Have a good one, and happy customizing.